3 years ago, I set up an experiment. I was keen to understand if it's really worth treating outdoor timber or if tanalisation and pressure treatment on timber actually works. So here is the experiment at the top of my garden, but first, over to Keith from the past.
Hello, Keith from the past here. The date is currently Monday, the 21st of June 2021, and I've prepared 6 samples of untreated 3x2s, 3 of which I'm going to leave as is, and 3 of which I'm going to treat myself using a wood preserver. And I've got another 6 samples of pressure treated 3x2, 3 of which have the pressure treated end still on them, and the other 3 have a freshly cut end on both sides. For these samples that I'm treating myself using a wood preserver, I'm going to apply a generous coat, let it dry, and then apply another generous coat. I'm even going to dunk the end grain in the treatment. That's actually what it recommends to do on the tin.
I labelled up each sample with a marker pen accordingly and placed them in 3 different scenarios at the top of our garden. The first scenario is outside, laying on the ground horizontally so that the side grain of the timber is in contact with the ground. The second scenario is with the samples placed vertically so that the end grain is in direct contact with the soil. And the third scenario is with each of the samples placed in a bucket of water. And over the past 3 years, each of the test pieces has endured all that the British weather had to throw at them, including being buried deep in snow, extreme dry spells where the water in the bucket had completely evaporated, the occasional bit of ice, and of course lots and lots of rain. Before we take a look at the samples though, let's talk about why we might consider treating our wood in the first place. When timber is used in an outdoor environment, there are a number of things that can damage it, such as too much moisture over long periods of time, because moisture which is absorbed into the wood softens the fibres, causing it to decay. Generally, if the wood can expel that moisture through evaporation into the air during drier periods, moisture is not normally an issue, which is why things like fence panels tend to last many, many years. Then there's wood-boring insects and microbes that live in the soil and feed on the wood. This is why timber should not be left in contact with the ground. Insects and microbes that live in the soil will eat away at it. And it's why things like fence posts rot away at ground level.
It's a bit soft.
It's generally where the wood is in contact with soil where it will rot away and decay. And that's why I tend to do everything I can for my outdoor projects to ensure that the timber is never in contact with the ground. There's also UV damage, which is where UV rays from the sun damages the wood fibres. This is why wood that is outside generally turns grey over time, because unless you give it a bit of a rub down and apply some kind of finish or coating on a pretty regular basis, UV damage will cause the wood to not only grey but also dry out, warp, crack and cup. And while there are a number of wood finishes out there that claim to protect the wood from UV damage, the truth is that there is no finish that can truly protect the wood from it unless it's regularly and thoroughly maintained. So that's why we might want to treat our wood, but what treatments and finishes are most appropriate for the job? Using pressure treated, also known as tanalised wood, is thought to be one of the most effective ways of making timber last longer in an outdoor environment. Pressure treatment or tanalising is a process that forces wood preservatives deep into the wood, and this preservative is poisonous to insects, fungus and bacteria, which is what gives it its durability. It's usually either green or brown in appearance, and often when you buy it from a timber merchant it will have a very high moisture content, because most wood suppliers generally don't allow time for the preservative to dry out before they sell it. Sometimes you'll even see incisions made in the pressure treated wood like this, which are made to help get that preservative as deep into the wood as possible. There are some downsides of pressure treatment or tanalising though. Because the preservatives that I used have changed over the years, before around 2006 I think it was, CCA or copper chromium arsenate was used, and I've heard many people in the industry say that the pressure treated wood back then was much more effective and long lasting. But due to concerns around arsenic being toxic to animals and humans, preservatives were changed mostly to ACQ treatment, which are thought to be somewhat less effective. Also, while pressure treatment is designed to help protect the wood from moisture and wood-boring insects, I don't believe it offers any protection from UV damage. And pressure treated wood is also more expensive. You can expect to pay often almost double the price for it in comparison to untreated timber. Another option is to apply wood preserver to the timber yourself, as I did 3 years ago to the test samples in this video. And as I often do with my outdoor projects, I also make sure that I treat any cuts that I've made to pressure treated timber just to make sure that that end grain is well protected. I have no idea if the preservatives in stuff like this are the same as the ones used in pressure treatment, but what I do know is that applying a preserver like this isn't going to penetrate deep into the wood like it does with pressure treatment. So on that basis, I think it's safe to assume that this would be less effective in comparison with pressure treatment, but maybe we'll find out in my experiment. Again, it's not going to protect the wood from UV damage, but at a cost of around £25 for a massive 5-litre tin like this, it's not ridiculously expensive. There are other treatments like creosote, which again I don't have much experience with, but it's meant to offer excellent protection from fungal growth and insect damage. However, in around 2003, the sale of it was prohibited for both professionals and amateurs due to it being considered a carcinogen. There are a number of alternatives available to buy though, where companies seem to get away with selling it by spelling creosote with a C instead of an S. Creocoat, I guess. And there are a whole host of other finishes designed for outdoor use. Film finishes such as stains and paints, which will offer some protection from moisture and UV damage, but I don't believe they offer much, if any, protection from insects. And also penetrating finishes like oils, which will repel moisture, and some of them help protect from UV damage, but again, probably not from insects. But all those finishes can only be expected to perform if they are well maintained over time and not left to deteriorate. Another option, of course, is to use a species of timber that is naturally very resistant to insect damage and rot. Woods like cedar, white oak, ipe, teak or iroko, for example. But those species are quite expensive to buy here in the UK. Right, I think we've waited long enough. Well, I certainly have. I've been waiting 3 years for this. I'm going to get these into the workshop and get them cleaned up so that we can take a closer look. I can definitely see some decay and some insects, lots of wood lice and a slug. And finally, the water sample, which has lots of grass growing in it. Most of the marker pen has worn away, but I was very careful in which order I placed them in the ground, and I've examined the footage so I know which is which. But just so that I don't make any mistakes, I think it's worth writing on these which is which. Right, so the samples have now dried out. Let's take a closer look at them. And the first scenario we're going to look at is where the samples were placed upright with their end grain in direct contact with the soil. And I'm going to give each of the samples a rating based on how much decay has occurred. Not very scientific, I know, but I'm not a scientist. So the first sample is the untreated one. And if I look at the bottom, I can see that quite a lot of decay has occurred. And some of that decay is also creeping up the sides. I measured the surface area of end grain that showed signs of decay using CAD software, and it made up 34% of the total area of the end grain. So I'm going to give this a decay ratio of 3.4 out of 10. Some of the wood fibres at the very end, I can also pick away just using my fingers. This area here is particularly rotten. And if I give it a good squeeze, wow. I'm going to rate this 5 out of 10 in terms of softness, based on nothing scientific, just my own judgment really. Next up is the sample that I applied preserver to, and wow, that's not good at all. This is much softer. Oh my God. This is actually much softer than the untreated sample. This is terrible. And for all these years, I've been using wood preserver. Maybe I shouldn't have bothered. Well, that is absolutely horrendous. Decay ratio on this one is a whopping 83%. So this gets an 8.3 decay ratio out of 10. And in terms of softness, it's a 9 out of 10. Next is the pressure treated timber with a freshly cut end. And there's quite a lot of decay on here too. Some of it's creeping up the sides again, but it's not as bad as the untreated sample. There are a few areas that I can pick at with my fingernail, but generally this is a little bit firmer than the other samples we've looked at so far. Area of decay on this, 3 out of 10, and I'll rate this 3.5 out of 10 in terms of softness. And finally, this is the pressure treated with the uncut end, so this end is full of preservative. Other than this small area here and some decay at the sides, it actually looks really quite intact, and I can't break away any of this with my fingers or fingernail, so I'm going to say this is the best one so far. Area of decay 0.7 and a 1 out of 10 for softness. The next scenario was with the side grain in contact with the ground, and this is the untreated sample, And I don't know if this will show up on camera, but the grain is really quite deep. I can get my thumb right in there and I can see some damage at the end here. This end is actually okay. I can't scrape any of this away with my fingernail, apart from a little bit here at the very end. Area of decay 4.4 and 3 out of 10 for softness. Next up is the sample that I applied preserver to, and oh dear, once again, this is incredibly soft. Yeah, it's definitely a lot worse than the first sample, which was completely untreated. So not good at all. Oh my God. I can pick away so much of this. Not good at all, and even in this area where it looks okay, again, the grain has sunken in quite a lot. There's some damage at the end. Area of decay 6.9 and 8 out of 10 for softness. This is the pressure treated with an uncut end. This has had quite a big chunk of it eaten away, but actually it's pretty firm. And this time there's none of that sunken grain in this area. Area of decay 3.4, but with this one I do wonder if there may have been some kind of defect in the grain that might have weakened the corner here or something. Certainly it was intact when I put it down, and I checked the ground around where the samples were and there were no chunks laying on the ground, so I can only assume it has been eaten away. Softness, 2 out of 10. And finally the pressure treated with the cut end, and interestingly, this one is completely solid on the surface that was actually down on the ground. At the end here, something has been eaten away at this quite a lot. I can't break it down with my finger though, and the other end looks good. This one was difficult to quantify, seeing as the face that was on the ground was in really good shape. But because of the small amount of damage to the end grain, I'm going to rate this 0.7 out of 10 and 1 out of 10 for softness. And finally, onto the samples that were put into a bucket of water. And interestingly, all 4 of these samples to me look pretty much identical. I can't see any signs of decay or rot on them. There was some white fungus when I took them out of the water, and that was on all 4 of the samples in roughly equal measures. But yeah, maybe the best way to preserve timber is to keep it in water by the looks of things. So yeah, I'm going to declare this test null and void because they all look the same to me. They are very heavy though, so they've got an awful lot of water inside them. I also thought I should factor in grain tightness into the data, because obviously timber with tighter growth rings is harder and therefore presumably more difficult for bugs or insects to eat. So I counted up all the growth rings and included that information in the set of data. So what have we learned? Well, firstly, treatments and preservatives aside, it's apparent that the softest sample of wood in my experiment after 3 years was also the one with the least growth rings. So perhaps I should give that particular self-treated sample the benefit of the doubt in terms of how badly it performed. However, the other self-treated sample had the highest growth rings out of all of them, and yet it also decayed far worse than the rest of the samples, second only to the other self-treated workpiece. So on that basis, I really am surprised by the results here, which I feel seem to demonstrate that, certainly in my tests, untreated wood actually performed better than wood that had preserver applied to it. It could be concluded that using wood preserver does nothing to protect the wood. In fact, maybe applying it even makes it more prone to damage. In hindsight, I should have set up more samples to get a bigger data set, but unfortunately, I don't have a time machine. Literally only last week, I bought myself a new tin of wood preserver, and now I kind of wish I hadn't have bothered.
No, not really.
I've also learned that pressure treated or tanalised wood is certainly more effective at protecting the wood compared with untreated or self-treated, which is probably what we would have all assumed anyway, so no big surprises there. But I was also still quite surprised at how prone it is to decay and insect damage. It's disappointing to see that after only 3 years. Thank you for watching.